And if I could be honest now, thinking back to that moment when my dad died, my faith died. Hey, I'm Jovan Glasgow. I'm a coach, speaker, author, and entrepreneur, originally from the Caribbean islands of Antigua and Barbuda. Growing up in the islands was amazing. I mean, we grew up strong family. It was my mom and dad had been married for 27 years. I had a younger sister. Really grew up in humble beginnings, built on faith, family, and love for all mankind. Loved going to the beaches. Loved playing cricket as well. Had an amazing community, not just in the church, but also in my neighborhood. We grew up in the church. My dad was actually a pastor. My mom would sing on like the worship team, and I actually played the drums. But really amazing upbringing. I know a lot of who I am today. I give credit to where I've come from and kind of my upbringing and my model. Yeah. So at the age of 18, my parents sent me off to college to Miami, Florida, to study aeronautical science. They wanted me to have an opportunity they never had at a great education. Really optimistic, man, really excited about this new life going off to college. I've watched so many movies and shows about people going to college in a different place. Really excited about just the possibilities. I wanted to become a pilot and also specialize in avionics. That was also I think my parents supporting me to pursuing that. And you're really going through college. College, as everybody knows, I joined the fraternity, all kind of crazy things were happening. But about my junior year, my life took a turn. I would go back home to the Caribbean islands where I worked a summer job in a bank. And on Fridays, my dad and I would go to lunch. And I remember this Friday, he came to pick me up, and my dad had a look on his face that's burnt into my memory even up to this day. It was a look of just overwhelm and a little bit of fear and uncertainty. And it wasn't like my dad. My dad was a positive man. He was a man who believed in, he was a faithful man, a man of faith. And so seeing my dad like this definitely sparked something in me, some curiosity. I remember walking to his car, and at the back of the car, before we got into the vehicle, he stopped me and he's like, "Son, I've been having some complications. Not really sure what it is, but I'm gonna go get some tests done. But don't worry, we're gonna beat it." My dad's words to me were everything. Even though the reality of what he was up against or how he looked seemed odd, I believe his words. About a year after that, we found out that what he had was called cholangiocarcinoma. It's a bile duct cancer that really kills the liver. So it causes eyes to turn yellow with jaundice, and his skin was itching, and he lost a tremendous weight in a matter of no time. And I think for me, you know, I was obviously still finishing up school, so I was flying back and forth from Miami in the Caribbean. I think for me, looking back to that moment, I was so hopeful, and I was so really just believing that everything was going to be okay, because that's the words that he spoke over his life, and how he would sing in faith and all these different things, that I didn't really slow down to understand the gravity of what was happening. Just after I graduated from college, so my father was able to attend my graduation, I got a call from my mom, because he was doing like therapy and he was going through different healing. And the last conversation I had with him was that, "Son, don't worry, I'm gonna be okay. I'm gonna see you in the summer." But I got a call from my mom a few weeks after that, and I picked the phone from her, and the first thing she asked me is, "How are you doing? Are you okay?" And this was like 1 a.m. My mom don't ever call me at 1 a.m., so I knew that something was wrong. And in that moment, she told me, "Your father just passed." That hit me like a train. In that moment, it didn't make sense, because I had hope in my heart, and I remember his last words of, "Everything is gonna be okay. I'm gonna see you in the summer." That wasn't the reality. Realizing now that I had to fly home for the funeral, and I actually was supposed to give the eulogy for the funeral. The eulogy in itself was so interesting, and I was in shock. I remember standing in front of this church of hundreds of people, reading this eulogy and cracking people up, making people laugh. And I remember people looking at me like, man, this young guy has so much strength. But in hindsight, I was numb. I was lost. I was broken. I was in shock. Just remember seeing the casket right in front of me and couldn't process in that moment that I was at my own father's funeral. I didn't have that in my plans. I thought I would have this man to guide me through life and to help me understand how to maneuver through life as a man. You know, I've thought to myself so many times, what's harder, never having a father or having a great father and having him taken away prematurely or when you need him the most. I didn't cry throughout that entire stretch. When I just found out, I cried a bit, but it wasn't really tears, like an emotional release, until I remember grabbing the casket. I was standing at the front of the casket on the left-hand side, walking it out the church. And while I was walking, it just dawned on me that I was about to take my father to the cemetery to bury him where I would never see him again. And in that moment, everything broke and I cried. I lost it while I was walking. I remember being at the burial site and just looking at the casket being lowered into the ground, and across from me on the other side of the hole, I was looking at my mom. And she was wrecked. She was present in a physical state, but it seemed like her mind and her spirit really just fell. With every lowering of the casket, I saw a little bit of hope just leave. You know, she had been with my dad for 27 years. That was the love of her life. She spoke so highly of him, and he would have given his life for her. And it wrecked my family. My father was the glue that held us all together. We had to now figure out how to go forward in life with such an integral part of our life missing. And if I could be honest now, thinking back to that moment when my dad died, my faith died. Because for me, I couldn't understand how a man who preached the gospel and who would give his last to help a neighbor. My mom and my dad would get into fights because he would buy a washing machine for the neighbor who didn't have anything to wash their clothes, knowing that our family wasn't in the best financial position. But that's the type of man that he was. But I couldn't understand how somebody who would give their life for others would end up losing their life to something this crazy, and why God would allow that to happen. And so in that moment, I realized that loss ripped a hole so deep in me, a hole that I spent the next 5 years of my life trying to fill with things. And looking back through it, that was probably the worst decision that I made, that the decision to run from God, the decision to look at this thing as me being mad at God. And so because I'm mad at God, I can't trust God with anything that I love, because trusting God with something you love could mean that he could take it away. And that's what started a rough 5-year run. So after losing my dad, and I had this hole in my heart that I would try to fill with things. You know, I was married. I was obviously in a relationship. I had a daughter. I have a daughter. But nothing that I had in my life could fill me. I was still so broken and didn't know how to truly get help. Didn't want to turn to God because I had drifted so far away at that point. I was living a lifestyle that I know wasn't pleasing. I was DJing, I was drinking. All this was happening in my life right now. But I remember in my marriage, ended up having a daughter, and I remember moments where I'd be taking care of her, and she would be looking at me smiling or laughing, and I couldn't even give her that level of love and emotion back, because here was this little girl looking to me to be her dad while I was missing mine. And I was so dead on the inside, still trying to find things to fill this void, find validation from others to fill this void. Alcohol, lust, all these different things to try to fill this void. And in going through after college, couldn't even work any jobs. I was DJing. I found myself DJing parties and making everybody else happy and making major moves from a DJing aspect, but always torn internally because nothing still filled this hole in my heart. DJing slowed down for a very long period, and my ex-wife, because you'll find out in a minute, I ended up getting divorced. Mom lost her job, and so she had to move out to live with her mom, and so her and my daughter moved out to live with her mom. I stayed in Miami to try to figure things out, but nothing came through. At that point, I ended up having to be evicted from my apartment because I couldn't afford the rent, and I slept on a friend's couch for a few months, still trying to figure things out, still refusing to turn to God. Ended up having to move out here. I remember one time putting together a playlist for a party, and while I was putting together this playlist, I felt like I had this voice just say enough. That's the only thing. And I knew right then in that moment what it was talking about. It was the life I was living, running, DJing. And so I decided in that moment to quit DJing and move to Tampa with my wife and my daughter. Still didn't deal with the issues that were really in my life, and that ended up turning into infidelity, where I actually committed adultery. And I remember having to confess that to my wife at the time, that I had made a bad decision and committed this act. And we sat in the living room and we talked about it, and in a moment she was like, I forgive you. Let's continue. Let's do this. And I looked at her and I told her no, because I knew that the infidelity wasn't the problem. It was the fact that I was still running from what I always knew I needed, and that was true healing from God. So a few months after that, I ended up becoming divorced. I told myself, this is my opportunity now to get my life together, to make things happen. And then some months after that, I got into another relationship. Probably should have took a lot more time to heal, but that's the thing about not putting God into that space and running away from God, that you just keep running into things that get you into even deeper of a mess. And this relationship for me didn't start off as me pursuing a relationship. It started off sexual, and that turned into a relationship. And I learned that this woman that I now loved and I now started to grow in a relationship with ended up having some heart issues that she was born with. And this turned into her having to have open heart surgery at a very young age. And so I had to go through that process with her. Such a strong girl, such a strong woman, and just trying to beat it the best that I could and show up the best way I knew how. But here it was again that I now fall in love with somebody, and they now are dealing with an illness. So I realized in hindsight what I tried to do was be God to her, because I figured if I could be there and if I could go above and beyond, even at the cost of knowing that I needed help, then I could save her from dying. And that sounds so consistent, because for me, I never had the opportunity to be there for my dad at the last stage of his life. After her open heart surgery, it went successful. She ended up becoming baptized and actually gave her life to the Lord. And I knew throughout this 5-year run, the only thing that could save me was the thing that I ran from. But in this moment, I realized that who the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and he stayed on me. And going through all this was when I made the decision to truly build a relationship with Jesus Christ. You know, my fate died when my dad died, because in hindsight, I didn't really have a relationship with Christ. I had a relationship with my father, who had a relationship with Christ. And it's not until I came to the end of myself and realized that the God of the universe, the creator of all things, still wanted to have a relationship with me. And that's all he was pursuing while I was running from him. And in that moment, when I look back through everything that I've been through, being homeless, being shot at, driving intoxicated, all the different things that should have took me out, and I was covered and I was given just this level of grace, I realized that God was keeping me even when I was running from him, because he had a plan for me. Losing my dad prematurely made me realize that so many people in life meandered through life with no purpose, no drive, no connection, no commitment, no real relationship with Christ. And because of that, we're lacking fulfillment, not happiness. I've dedicated my entire life to helping people to move away from happiness to finding fulfillment. And fulfillment, as I see now and as I know, is really found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. The whole premise and mindset of, if any man be in Christ, he's a new creation. Old things are passed away, and behold, all things are made new. This is the story of my life. Because for most people that see me now and hear my story, it can't even connect. It doesn't even match up. The man that I am today and the man that I'll continue to be would have only been possible because of the love of God. And God's love is not man's love. When we talk about God being good, and we say, how could a good God take your father prematurely? I had to realize that my definition of good is not God's definition of good. God's goodness is through an eternal lens. My goodness is through a finite lens. So if I'm looking at a situation from a temporary lens, and I'm really having a perspective with a God who views that situation through an eternal lens, our definition of good is different. I was looking for an apartment, and I met a stranger, and we started talking about my father and my story. And he looked at me and he said, "Why do you miss your dad?" Never been asked that question, but I thought it was a weird question. He said, "Do you miss him, his presence, him not being here anymore? Do you miss the fact that he hasn't seen the man that you've become?" I said, "I have accepted that he's not here with me, but I miss the opportunity for him to see the return on his investment." And he said something to me first that is kind of cliche. I've heard it a lot. He says, "Well, your father's here and he still sees you." But he took it a layer differently. But he said, "Do you ever think that maybe there was a covering and protection that you needed for your life, for your calling, that your father couldn't have given to you in the physical, but only in the spiritual?" And that wrecked me. And I felt that in a whole different way, because I know that the plans that God has for me was ordained before I was formed in my mother's womb. And I have a purpose. And I'm not defined by what I've lost. I'm not defined by what I have. I'm defined by who I am. And who I am is beloved. I am a child of the King. I am a man of purpose. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And for me, I could do nothing without my relationship with Jesus Christ. I think there's a difference between being a believer and a follower of Jesus. Growing up and thinking back through my story, I believed, but I didn't follow. Believing is really having the ideation of God. Following is having the reality of who he is. It's the whole concept of denying yourself, picking up your cross and following me. It's not choosing your decisions or making decisions based on your understanding, but submitting your life to Christ, knowing that you were bought with a price. For me, a follower is being sold out, is being all in. It's saying that at the end of the day, on a day-to-day basis, everything that I choose to be, everything that I choose to own, the decisions that I make are not my decisions to make, because my life was bought and protected with a price. So I have a responsibility to live out the expectation that God has for me. So being a follower at the end of the day, simply denying yourself, picking up your cross, which is your calling, the thing that you were innately created to do, and following Christ, not when it's convenient, not when circumstances are good, but following God and trusting him even when you can't trace him. For me, that's what it means to be a follower. It's to deny Jovan and to follow Christ with my whole heart, regardless if I can see where I'm going.